Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those of you watching on the webcast in different time zones. My name is Anita Day, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here to the Federal Communications Commission. If you aren't familiar with what the FCC does, we have a role to play in almost every aspect of communications. We manage much of the invisible spectrum that your wireless devices use. We certify the equipment that brings communications to your home. We work to make sure the media landscape is rich and varied, and we watch out for the consumer. And it is for our consumer-oriented work that we're here today. This is the first in a series of info sessions on consumer-oriented topics organized by my bureau, Consumer and Governmental Affairs. We'll be discussing technology transitions. Simply stated, technology transitions are the process of changing the wires that lead to your home to other, more modern infrastructure like fiber optic cables or wireless. The process could also involve a change in the technology that runs over the infrastructure to bring voice and data to your home. But what does that mean for the consumer? That is what our speakers will be discussing over the next hour. Today, I am joined by Peter Saharko and Michelle Levy-Burlov from the Wireline Competition Bureau. They literally wrote the rules on this topic, so they will be explaining what technology transitions are. Suzanne Rosen-Singleton of our Disability Rights Office in my bureau will talk about the possible impact of the transitions on people with disabilities. And Linda Pintro of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau will tell us about how tech transitions and emergency calling are related. So we're going to have time for questions towards the end of the hour after everyone has spoken. So web stream watchers, please email your questions to livequestions@fcc.gov. You can also tweet us your questions. We are at FCC, and you can use the hashtag FCCLive. If we can't answer all the emailed and tweeted questions, we will get back to people in the next week or so. If you're in the room and we don't get to your question, please send it to us at outreach@fcc.gov, and we will get back to you. Please note, today our goal is to give a general overview of tech transitions and how it affects consumers, so we won't be discussing any ongoing concerns that the Commission is already aware of. So with that, I would like to turn to Peter and Michelle to tell us exactly what tech transitions are.
Thanks so much, Anita, and thanks for putting this great event together. We know how much hard work has gone into this, and you've really done a tremendous job. And it's a great turnout, and we hope that there'll be a lot of events like this that will help consumers learn about all the issues here at the Commission. But it's great that we're starting with this topic. And Anita, you've really helped to frame the issue quite well here at the start. But I just want to amplify a point that you made in kind of explaining what largely Michelle will be talking about, but that I'll be touching on first. And that is, when you hear the term tech transitions, we're really talking about two different interrelated issues. The first is, you traditionally get phone service over copper wires. So the type of cables, what we might call the physical infrastructure that governs the way the communications are coming to you. Then there's the service that runs on those wires. The term of art for it, for the traditional phone service that so many people that we call POTS, plain old telephone service, is TDM service. And right now, that's one thing. So both of these things are undergoing transitions. The physical infrastructure, as Anita noted, is changing from copper to any number of different types of physical infrastructures, whether it be fiber or any other kind. It's really not limited in any way. There are a set of rules related to the retirement of copper infrastructure that Michelle will be talking about, and a number of consumer protections. Those were implemented in August of 2015, so they're effective now. So those are kind of an important focus for today, and we'll focus on those in a couple of minutes. The other aspect of this is if your service changes. So that would be the TDM service I was talking about. Now, many carriers are considering changing to an Internet Protocol or IP type of service. If you have a change in service, you are required to file an application with the Commission, which the Commission has to approve in order to change your service. we wrote rules in July 2016 governing the service discontinuance process. So those rules are not effective yet, but we'll be happy to talk about them. They're still in the process of becoming final. But the copper retirement rules, in contrast, when the physical infrastructure changes, consumers have to be notified, but there's no application process. There's no requirement for carriers to get approval of the commission to make that change. So that's the key distinction between those two things, and I'm happy to amplify that point. But if it's a physical infrastructure change, you have to notify customers, but if the service doesn't change, there's no application to the commission. If the service changes, you have to apply to the commission. And that's really the main point I wanted to make, because that's confusing to people who've been doing this for 20 years, and so I wanted to kind of start with that point. And I'll just note, I've just happened to spend a lot of time on the service end of things, so I was about to call them my rules in a very narcissistic moment. For the service discontinuance rules, they aren't final yet, but one thing worth noting before I turn it over to Michelle is there are significant consumer education requirements that are included in those rules, and they involve notifying customers and their bills, having a consumer hotline, and also making sure that people in the disability community have people available to provide information to them about how this will uniquely affect them. And there are also notice requirements that are similar but slightly different from the notice that needs to be required in the case of a retirement. But with all that being said about the service discontinuance process, I'm now going to turn it over to Michelle to talk about the retirement of traditional infrastructure and the rules that govern how consumers need to be notified and protected in those cases. So Michelle is the expert on this, and we look forward to hearing from her.
So carriers have been changing their physical infrastructure for years now, switching from copper to fiber or other types of technologies. Until fairly recently, it's largely been on a voluntary basis from the consumer's perspective. That's starting to change, where consumers are now being forced off of copper onto fiber, and it's raising some concerns for people who are a little resistant to the way that might possibly affect how they get their service. One of the big issues is line power. Copper can conduct power, and so if your power goes out, you're still going to get phone service because you're going to get power, or would have gotten power, from the carrier's central office. Over fiber, line power doesn't get conducted. A lot of people don't understand that even if they have copper to their home at this point, they may no longer have line power because parts of the wires leading up to the distribution point where their copper starts have already been changed to fiber. But Linda Pintro from our Public Safety Homeland Security Bureau is going to address that in a little more detail. What I'm going to talk more about is, can they do this? Can your company involuntarily move you from copper to fiber? Short answer is yes, they can. They can make any changes to their network that they need to make as long as they follow our rules in terms of giving proper notice. It shouldn't have any significant effect on your telephone service, and we have adopted new rules, or last year we adopted new rules that became effective in March to make sure that you as a consumer get adequate notice. If the retirement involves the part of the network that goes from the distribution point to your house, you as a consumer have to get notice, direct notice from your carrier 3 months in advance, and it has to provide you sufficient information to enable you to make an informed decision as to whether you want to continue getting the service that you subscribe to from your carrier, or if you maybe want to go elsewhere. In that notice that they send you, they have to give you a very neutral statement about the kinds of services that they offer aside from what you already get. They cannot try to upsell you to those services. They can do that in other marketing materials, but in the commission-mandated notice about the copper retirement, they have to give you just a neutral statement about the services that they offer. If there are going to be any changes to the service, they have to notify you of that as well. But if there is a change in the service, as Peter said, that is more likely a discontinuance of service for which they actually must apply to the commission for authorization, and there are other notice requirements that go along with that. If your company says that the only way to fix the problem, a service quality problem that you're having, is to move you onto something other than copper, can they do that? Well, if they haven't retired copper in that area, they are required under our rules to maintain it. So if you're having a service quality issue with your copper-based service, they can't force you off of it unless they actually go through the copper retirement process and all of the notice requirements that go along with that. Can you switch back to copper if you've switched to fiber or something else? Maybe, maybe not. If they've retired the copper, in all likelihood, there is no other provider in the area that is going to afford copper-based service, and you will not be able to switch back to copper. If they want you to voluntarily subscribe to a next-generation service, what does that mean for you? Well, it means it's voluntary. You don't have to subscribe to anything else. If they are telling you it's involuntary, again, that's a discontinuance, and they have to go through the entire application process, notice to the customers, etc. If they are trying to involuntarily discontinue the service, you do have an opportunity to object. You'll get notice directly from your carrier. That notice has to tell you that you are entitled to file comments or objections, the amount of time you have in which to do that, and how to file those comments or objections. If you are concerned that there may be technology transitions going on in your area that you're unaware of, you can contact your state PUC, or Public Utility Commission. Carriers are required to notice the states and, if applicable, tribal entities as to whether there are discontinuances that they're planning or copper retirements. And they can also let you know about any other service providers that may be in the area if you want to look into possibly switching service. And that is primarily what how this applies to consumers specifically. There are a whole set of different issues when it comes to wholesale carriers, but I will now turn it over to the next person in line, right, which I believe is Suzanne.
Okay, thank you. I'm Susie Rosen-Singleton from the Disability Rights Office. I am the chief of that office, and I'm here today to address the question, what does tech transitions mean for people with disabilities? You've already heard some of these new requirements that are for the general population that also apply to people with disabilities, but we're talking specifically about impacts on people with disabilities. And before I get on into the requirements of our order, I want us to look at the issue of how the lack of access impacts people with disabilities more broadly. As you know, new technology can provide great opportunities that allow for everyone, including people with disabilities, to do things that weren't once thought to be possible. But it can also impede us from accessing things that we used to have, particular people with disabilities. If important measures aren't taken to ensure that these advances are made accessible, it can really cause problems, and they need to be integrated into this process. So, for example, I'll give you an example that's not specifically related to the Commission's work, but one that is often cited in the disability community, and it is silent movies. So some of you may recall many, many years ago when movies first came out and they were silent. That meant that deaf people could go to the movies anytime because any captions were in titles on the screen for silent movies, and there was no need to worry about whether these movies were accessible to people who could not hear. Friends and family could all enjoy movies regardless of their ability to hear them and could access all of the content there. Then, when the talkie aspect was added into movies, all of a sudden deaf audiences were excluded from accessing these movies. And as of today, we still have an open rulemaking that is making some progress in the U.S. Department of Justice to address whether or not they're required to caption any movie in movie theaters. And there is new technology available that, again, has excluded people with disabilities. So we have to make sure that that is kept in mind. Another example is the smartphone. As many of us have seen, the advantages of the smartphone in providing a number of functionalities that we no longer, or that we historically did not have access to, getting information on the internet very quickly through your smartphone. But for those who are blind or visually impaired, we no longer have, the rotary dial on your phone. You no longer even have buttons that you actuate by pressing them. You're looking at a smooth screen that was no longer accessible. That lack translated into a real severe impact on people who are blind or visually impaired, who are not able to access that information on the phone without having some more thought put into how that access was going to happen. So employment opportunities, education opportunities were not necessarily available to these people. Even though the technology made this advancement, some people with disabilities were being left behind. And that was addressed by the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act by the Commission through Section 718 in order to ensure that people who are blind or visually impaired could access their internet browsers on their phones, as well as have other options to ensure that the phone itself is accessible. So I am sure that many of you have your stories that you could share as well about how new technology can impact people with disabilities. You may have experienced that firsthand, the inability to access something that you used to have because of the progress that technology has made. However, there is the upside to new technology as well, and that is that people with disabilities, when we have such requirements to enable accessibility on these devices, they benefit those who do not need access to those features for accessibility. For example, captioning of video programming. We see a lot of people who enjoy the benefits of captioning in gyms and restaurants and other noisy environments are able to take advantage of the captions there, even though they don't need them for accessibility. Curb cuts is not a technological example, but just a commonly referenced example where curb cuts made for access from streets to sidewalks were not only used by people with wheelchairs, but also people that were using rolling suitcases, who are also using strollers and what have you. And we see that now we are seeing the same thing with text messaging, where the younger generation, early adopters of text messaging, prefer text messaging over voice communication. That is some way that we see that people with disabilities, particularly deaf people, are able to find that they are on even footing because of this advancement in technology. With that in mind, I would like to discuss this particular order that my colleagues have shared so much about already. It was released on July 15th. To look at how tech transitions can be made smoothly for everyone, including people with disabilities. The new rules require that replacement services for these networks should provide a level of accessibility, usability, and compatibility for consumers with disabilities, as effective as the legacy voice systems that they were accustomed to using in order to be considered an adequate replacement as a new technology. It's also important to remember that the Commission already has existing rules about advanced communication services, which is what they were referred to and usually what we're looking at on these newer networks, like VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol technologies. That's a significant portion of this tech transition into more IP networks. That application from moving from your POTS system to your VoIP system is intended to affect that transition. It must be accessible, usable, and compatible in terms of services, functionality. If we're talking about voicemail, any kind of interactive menu system, advanced communication services, and when in the case that some of these things are either not accessible or not achievable, the service providers are required to ensure that the replacement technology on their application is compatible with existing peripheral devices that consumer preferences equipment when used, and people with disabilities often are using their own equipment. So in the event that the replacement service or equipment is not accessible, it must be able to work with equipment that will make it accessible. So if you're thinking about, for example, a refreshable braille display that needs to be able to interface with a phone in order to help people communicate. And that standard is under Section 255, readily achievable, and if it is not readily achievable, then you've got 716, which again, that is for those who would like to have more information. I'd be happy to provide that later after the session, but it is under the Communications Act of 1934. We have those particular requirements that have already been in place. This includes devices that are used to make or receive telephone calls, whether they're through the telephone network or over IP networks, electronic messaging systems like email, SMS, the short message service for text messaging must be accessible. And we also have the advanced communication services, as I mentioned, or we call ACS. So that's the 4 different categories. And the fourth one is interoperable video conferencing. And that is still the subject of an open rulemaking here at the Commission. We also, in our rules, already require access to telecommunications relay service that cannot be impacted by the transition to a new piece of equipment or technology. Relay services that help provide access to people who are deaf or hard of hearing, deaf blind, or speech disabled through relay cannot be impacted. The parties must be able to continue to contact those services and make use of those services regardless of a transition to a new network. A few more things, and then I'm going to be wrapping up here. The Commission recognizes that because of new technology and its promulgation, there are a lot of potential increases in functions and features that can be used, and we certainly do encourage in this order for carriers to actually adopt them and make them available to all of their consumers. One example is real-time text, or RTT as we call it, in which we are encouraging the adoption of a newer technology. Real-time text is a technology that is used to replace the TTY on newer IP networks that will provide the opportunity to have text-based communication for those who are deaf, hard of hearing, speech disabled, or deaf blind, and to eventually phase out TTYs because those connections to the legacy network are no longer compatible with the newer networks. It is a really important thing, particularly in emergency context, to have that. High definition voice is another tech transition that we are hoping to encourage that helps for people who have hearing loss to access telecommunications more easily. We also encourage providers to make this transition as simple and inexpensive as possible, particularly for consumers with disabilities, including all of their consumers, that they should not be forced to purchase or have any other increased cost for those consumers in order to access those services. We are encouraging that the companies make efforts to use the existing technology or to make any solutions affordable. We also require that providers give adequate educational and outreach materials before any changes are being made, in particular for consumers with disabilities, about the impacts of the transition. Any hotlines, materials, or staff must also be available and accessible to people with disabilities in order to be able to help people with disabilities with particularly complex disability issues and questions that are affecting them as they undergo that tech transition. On August 4th of 2016, we released an order from the Commission making our National Deafblind Equipment Distribution Program a permanent fixture at the Commission here. This program is provided $10 million a year annually in order to distribute telecommunications equipment to low-income deaf blind people who apply to this program, and particularly access to IP-based information telecommunication services and equipment. To sum up, if you do experience some problem with access to new technology or IP networks because of your disability, or you find that some functionality or equipment or service that historically was available to you is no longer accessible because of the transition, so because of a software upgrade, you see that your hearing aid is now not compatible with your phone, as one example, please let us know at the Commission. You can contact us through fcc.gov/complaints. Or you can email us, dro@fcc.gov, and we will work with you to ensure that your concerns are addressed to the extent that we can. Again, to sum up, disability rights are protected by the Commission here. There are a number of Commission rules that mandate access to video programming, telecommunications, in order to bridge this digital divide. and to allow everyone to have an opportunity, including people with disabilities, to be truly connected with accessible communications programs, equipment, and services, which is really, those are core concepts for us. And we're continuing to move forward with that philosophy here at the Commission. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Intro. Because we're in the midst of a hurricane season, if you haven't thought about it before, there's probably no better time than now to think about backup power for your home, so I welcome this opportunity to address you. As some of you may recall, when Hurricane Sandy hit the East Coast in October 2012, she left approximately 8.5 million customers without power. Unless you take steps to maintain 911 access during outages, your phone service may not be available. During power outages, traditional landline telephone service, which is traditionally provided through copper wires, as Peter explained, they were originally built for voice-only services. Typically, they continued to work. Traditional landline phone service has what is sometimes called line powering, as Peter referred to. That is, the traditional landline telephone service comes with its own electricity, and it keeps working even when there is no other electricity in your home. However, telephone companies, as you've heard, nationwide are upgrading their landline networks. They're upgrading it with new technology capable of providing much more than voice-only services. As you know, among other things, they now provide higher speed internet, video, and interactive features. The transition to modern communications networks can also vastly improve 911 service and help first responders during emergencies. Unfortunately, when the electricity goes out in your home, the modern alternatives to copper, fiber, coaxial cable, wireless, etc., they usually need battery-provided backup power to keep operating. Any phone connected to voice over internet protocol services or fiber optic networks won't work if you lose electric power and don't have a battery backup for the phone modem. The Commission has thought about this transition to new technology and how it may affect your ability to call 911 during a power outage. One step we've taken is adopting backup power rules for certain companies that provide home voice services. The rules that we adopted in August 2015, they require providers of modern residential voice phone service to ensure that standby backup power is available for consumers to purchase for all provider-furnished equipment and devices that are installed and operated at your home, if these must be maintained for you to access 911 services. The provider has to offer the backup power either directly or from a third-party retailer. Under the rules that we adopted in 2015, the provider must make that offer at the point of sale or when a customer first agrees to purchase non-line powered home voice service. In June of this year, we adopted another set of rules stating that before a service provider makes a change, which would result in the customer receiving home voice service that doesn't come with its own electricity, the service provider must also offer to the customer the option to buy a backup battery. In both cases, the service provider must provide information to help the customer make an informed decision about whether to purchase backup power. Consequently, if your phone company has told you that it is replacing some or all of the copper wires that bring telephone service to your home, or you're receiving your home voice service through the internet, the company providing it should have told you that, one, you have the option to buy backup power for your voice service, as well as, two, explain the consequences of not doing so. That is, providers must give consumers the information that they need to make an informed decision when it makes sense to give it to consumers. The backup power that the company offers to you now must be able to last at least 8 hours when the power is out. In a couple of years, the requirement is for it to last 24 hours. So there are generally 5 things that a provider must tell a consumer. First thing, that there is backup power that's available. Second, they have to tell you the service limitations with and without backup power. Now, this includes information about the impact of outages on the use of 911 services and the type of service that will continue to work with backup power. This is important because we believe that most other services at the consumer premises, such as home security, medical monitoring devices, and other similar equipment, probably not be powered, by the backup power source for voice services. The provider also has to give you information about purchasing and replacement options. This is to, again, enable consumers to make informed decisions regarding whether to purchase backup power and how to find the backup power that's compatible with the service. Fourth thing that the provider must tell the consumer is the expected backup power duration. This should include information about usage and storage conditions, as both will impact how long your battery will last. Providers' fifth piece of information to you should be testing and monitoring. They need to tell consumers how they may operate the backup power. All of this information must be disclosed to the consumer in a manner that is calculated to reach the individual consumer while taking into consideration the consumer's preferences. It's important to note that provider can't simply post it on a website somewhere. They have to do something in addition to that. So just to recap, the phone company must tell you about and give you the opportunity to acquire backup power. And this is supposed to happen when you first agree to purchase home voice service without power, or 2, before the service provider discontinued your fixed voice service, which before the technology transition came with its own electricity. To make sure that you can make an emergency call during a power outage, we suggest you contact your provider and get that backup power for your home voice service. Alternatively, you can buy the battery or another kind of backup power from another company. For example, you can get an uninterruptible power supply or a generator, which can be used to keep more than just your telephone working during power outages. While using your mobile phone to call 911 is also an option, the mobile phone is only effective if you keep your wireless phone charged and have made plans to keep it charged during an outage. That's all the information I have for you. If you have questions.
All right. Thank you, Linda, Susie, Michelle, and Peter. So now is our chance to ask questions of our speakers. If there's anything that they've said that you'd like them to repeat, or anything that they haven't addressed, this is a good chance. We have a microphone for those in the room in the middle of the aisle, so please feel free to step up, and we'll call on you for your question. And we're also taking live questions from those on the web at livequestions@fcc.gov. Thank you. And we have some right here. So while we're waiting for someone to step up to the mic, I'll ask, what should I do if a new technology isn't accessible to me as a person with a disability? So I think that's right up Susie's aisle.
Okay, thank you for that question, first of all. If you find that a technology is not accessible for you for whatever reason, please feel free to call or contact us at the FCC. You can send us an email at the Disability Rights Office, and that contact information is on the web. But basically, you can visit www.fcc.gov/disability, and you will see there on that page a variety of ways that you can reach out to us. We have a video phone for those who want to call us directly using sign language, or We certainly have email. There's also voice line. There's a TTY. And if you really would like to investigate your complaint, you can feel free to file it at your convenience online at fcc.gov/complaints. Of course, you may want to consider also contacting your provider as well, because you may find that there are some measures that could be taken to resolve that situation from your provider as well. So I would recommend contacting your provider or equipment manufacturer directly as well. And that is your choice, but you can certainly always feel free to contact us as well.
Thank you, Susie. I see we have a question in the room. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Debbie Goldman with the Communication Workers of America. First of all, I want to thank you for holding this session. This is so important to get this information out. And I assume and want to encourage that the excellent and clear information that you have produced and that you've said today, you will develop a plan to share this information to community-based organizations, to labor organizations, and to state commissions, that you have an outreach plan that continues this excellent work. I wanted to just confirm something that Michelle, you said earlier. What I heard you say is until a company files and gets files a copper retirement plan, they have an obligation to properly maintain their copper service to the customer. Did I hear you correctly? And if somebody feels that that is not happening, what should they do?
So under the rules that were adopted last year, August of 2015, which became effective in March, carriers can have what's called a de facto retirement if they fail to properly maintain their copper lines and service is no longer able to be provided over those lines. So they are, unless they specifically retire their copper, they are required to maintain their copper lines and provide service over those lines. If a consumer feels that they are not getting quality service over their copper, that maybe the copper is degraded in a way that the carrier can no longer provide quality service over it, they should contact their state PUC. Many of the state PUCs have specific rules about maintaining copper lines. They can file complaints here. I believe consumer complaints at fcc.gov.
Could you say that again?
Consumer complaints, no space.
Consumer complaints
At
.fcc.gov.
.fcc.gov. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Or certainly a little bit easier if someone's trying to remember it, but fcc.gov and then / complaints will also get you there.
Right. You can go to the Consumer Governmental Affairs webpage on the fcc.gov site, and it's got a portal to file your complaints on there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Do I see any more questions in the room right now? No. So I'll ask one of the other questions that I got from live questions. And Michelle, I think you would address this, but I'll just ask it again to clarify. Can I opt out of receiving my home phone service to over the modern alternatives to copper wires?
Well, that depends. If the carrier has retired their copper service through the whole notice process that is required by our rules, then you won't necessarily be able to opt out of moving on to a different type of technology. It doesn't mean you have to purchase a next generation service, because unless they are discontinuing what Peter referred to as the TDM service, the legacy plain old telephone service, if they have not discontinued that, they have to then continue to provide that over fiber. So it'll have all the same features, functionalities. Your fax machine should work. Your alarm monitoring system should work. Your heart monitoring systems should work. You just won't have line power in the event of a power outage, and you'll need the backup power that Linda spoke about. If they have, in fact, discontinued the legacy service, then unless there's another provider in the area, which is not likely, that will provide that TDM service, you're probably not going to have a choice to stay with a legacy service, but you will have a choice potentially, and this is where you need to talk to your service provider about what's available in the area. You might have to go onto an IP-based service, you might have to go onto a wireless service, a cable-provided service, satellite service, depends upon what is offered in your area.
Thank you. And I heard the printer behind me. Was that another question? Yes. Thank you. So this one says, carrier backup power pricing is not affordable by everyone. Some carriers charge $99 to purchase backup power. Why were carriers not required to provide the backup power free of charge or included within their pricing for the newer technology? Linda, I think that's you.
Yes. That definitely is something that we thought about when we were considering the initial backup power rules that were adopted in 2015. It is very much important to ensure that all consumers have the ability to communicate during a power outage. And we had to balance many competing interests and concluded that requiring backup power for all consumers, including those who do not want or need it, is an expensive and not very efficient method to move forward. So I guess the short answer to the question is that we considered many interests in coming to the conclusion and giving consumers the opportunity to choose, consumer choice, and seemed to us to be the right way to go at that time.
And Linda, I think I recall you saying in your presentation that people were not obligated to buy anything, of course, from their carrier, but they could get a battery from elsewhere, an outside supplier. So it's possible that the price could be much lower and more manageable if the consumer did a little bit of shopping around. Is that
That's
correct?
true, and absolutely, because just before I came here, I did a little shopping around on the internet myself just to see what was being charged. And I did find that some batteries were being offered for as low as $35. So, and this was just from maybe 10 minutes of searching. Mm-hmm. I also noticed in my quick review before coming here in order to be prepared with some real-world facts that some providers were including the backup battery in the initial installation of the modem.
Okay, so we have a lot of different kinds of things happening out there, so people should certainly check with their providers.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think I see another question in the room.
Yes, certainly. Hello, my name is Taylor Mayer, and I represent a group of deaf and hard of hearing individuals that are formed a consumer group. And I have a question for both Susie and Linda. It crosses into disability and emergency access to 911 services. I'm going to use my home as an example here in this situation. I do have backup power at my home, which I understand works with the landline phone, and the landline phone can run over that. However, the Wi-Fi connection in my home requires power, not backup battery power. And because I rely on that to make 911 calls via video relay service, so I happen to also have a generator at my particular home, It is not a solution that's very affordable. It's an $800 solution for me, and there are some consumers who wouldn't be able to afford that, and even those who potentially could afford a generator. The run time of a generator is only 8 hours, which is not very long in the grand scheme of things. So in that case, what should a deaf or hard of hearing consumer do in that situation?
Well, I'll take a stab at part of the answer, and I hope that Susie can fill in the rest. With regards to the modem, 8-hour battery would be attached to the modem. The modem is what communicates with your internet service provider's network. So what would happen when the power goes out?
Linda, could you get closer to the mic? Sorry.
Oh. Okay, so what would happen when the power goes out is that the 8-hour battery that's in the modem would kick in. But the modem then would allow only voice calls to go through. And so you're absolutely correct in that the Wi-Fi would not work. Data services would not be available. This is in large part to conserve the power. I'm not able to address the solutions, though, for those who are relying on the data services, which seems to be the other part of your question.
And I'd like to add to that answer as well. Thank you first, Linda, for that and elaborating about the battery aspect of it. As to what solutions may be available there, at this point, it will be what you have used if you need to contact emergency personnel. You'll want to use what you have been using, and that's understandable. And sometimes that may end up being text to 911, if text to 911 is available in your local area. It may end up being the use of video relay services or a captioned telephone service or whatever measure you have been using to access telecommunications. So you will want to use that in the event of an emergency to contact emergency personnel. I wanted to follow up quickly. It's not something you necessarily need to respond to, but just to make note of. If the Wi-Fi is not working and I were trying to contact emergency services in the event of a power outage, everyone is going to be using their cellular service. And so if I am using my cellular service on my mobile device, those networks quickly get congested, and so then I may have a problem getting access to sufficient data in order to be able to access relay service. Thank you.
That's a very good point. Thank you so much. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions here, so I'll read this one. How would the changeover from copper to fiber networks affect access to telecommunications relay and video relay for deaf and hard of hearing consumers? So Susie, would you like to take that?
Could you repeat the question, please?
How would the changeover from copper to fiber networks affect access to telecommunications relay and video relay for deaf and hard of hearing consumers?
Okay, thank you for that question. Thank you for repeating it. As I described before, your access to TRS cannot be adversely affected by a transition. So if you feel that you are no longer able to access that because of a transition, please let us know at the Commission, because that it should be, according to our rules, no impact at all, given the technology and the features that are meant to be moved directly from any old service into any new service. And I can also expand on the previous question about emergency access as well. I do want to also mention that the Commission is working on improving the situation that you described with NG, or Next Generation 911, in terms of how we can address the problem that was brought up by our previous question, and that is something that is very much in the works right now.
Thank you. So I've got a couple of questions from Twitter here, and they overlap. I'll read them both together. will the consumer information be available in multiple languages? And also, how does the tech transitions affect bilingual consumers? So, Peter and Michelle, have you had any experience with this? How the companies are communicating with their consumers?
The new rules, like I said, have been in effect since March. I don't believe I've yet seen copper retirement notices that are being sent out to multiple language users. If they do make it available in, I don't want to misspeak because I haven't looked at that part of the rule in a little while. I apologize. But I think if the carrier already communicates to a consumer in a specific language, in a specific way, I think they're supposed to do all of their notices to the consumer in that same way.
And Peter, did you?
Yeah, I was going to follow up on that. And that with the discontinuance rules, which are the second set of rules that are not effective yet, we just spoke on this very issue specifically with the consumer education materials that I was referencing. And Michelle has identified the point exactly right, but I'll just amplify it. And that is, if you communicate with customers in a specific language, which means that you're reaching out to these people and you know your business and you know that they communicate in that language, then you need to provide the consumer education materials in that language. But I also want to come back to the last question, which isn't really specified in my area, but make a more general point about it, because I think it's an important question. And that is just kind of the way we do things here, is that we deal with a large problem and we address it as broadly as possible in the first step. But then there's going to be specific individual problems that are not going to be caught by that initial effort. And then our process is a process of drilling down, learning from all of you consumers what those problems are, and then going back to the plate again and addressing those. And those are generally harder and they're more specific, but that's kind of the way this works. We set broad rules that are going to be able to address most problems, but then we drill down, almost kind of an inverted pyramid. And I just wanted to make that point as we hear some specific issues that come up. We're always thinking about these things and we're always ready to go back in and address them as they come up.
I'd also like to add one thing with regards to the language issue, and that's with regards to the backup power. Our rules do say that the provider should provide the disclosures by means reasonably calculated to reach the consumer, and the important part is with due consideration for the preferences of the customer. When we said that it takes into account not just your normal means of communicating via paper or email or text, it also takes into account the languages. The due consideration for the consumer's preference would include language preference to the extent that that is the ongoing basis of communication.
Thank you. So, do I see any more questions in the room? Okay, so I think it's a good time to wrap up. So I'd just like to thank you for coming or watching our very first info session. I'd like to thank our speakers very much for their informative presentations and for taking questions. And I'd also like to thank Anthony Butler, Kayla Hernandez-Ulloa, Sherry Dawson, and the rest of the team for making this possible. If you would like to be informed of future consumer outreach-oriented events, please email us at outreach@fcc.gov. For those in the room, we have printouts of the Tech Transitions Consumer Guide in the back. Some of you may have picked it up on your way in. It's also available at fcc.gov. If you need materials in accessible formats, please just let us know and we can provide them. And thank you for coming and thank you for watching, and good afternoon.